Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me today. Did you know that millennials have the lowest homeownership rate of any generation? Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about why. And so, thank you for joining me today and welcome and happy Women's History Month. I'm Christina Green. I'm generational translator, speaker, and founder of Cardigan Careers. And today we're continuing our series for Women's History Month, where each week we're diving into women's experiences of each generation in the workplace to gain a greater appreciation, right? So how can we forge ahead together while understanding each generation and the contribution of those generations to the workforce? Now, and today we are honoring millennial women who have been at the front lines of change. They've been carrying the torch of the women of those who've come before us, as well as for everyone moving forward. So let's go ahead and get into it. So, millennials are the innovators of culture and purpose. And I'm going to prove to you why, right? Although they may be the presumed thorn in the side of the boomers, right? Millennials are actually the first generation to openly prioritize their mental health at work. So, this is something that actually benefits all of us, but for some reason, people complain about this. So, let's dive into a few more details. So now millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. They're about 72 million in size. Now, this rivals the boomer generation. We're just under 72 million. Now, these are US numbers, but they're also born to elder Gen Xers, right? So Gen Xers were born in 65 and through 1980. Now, and the Gen Xers, it's important to understand what their values were instilled into the millennials, right? Especially the elder millennials. The Gen Xers, their parents of millennials, valued independence, right? We know, as speaking as a Gen X, we were very resilient, very independent, right? We spent a lot of time, if you will, kind of on our own. And so they instilled these values into their children, the millennials as well. So this to be independent, to be resilient, to be resourceful, to be able to, kind of, even if they were, have multiple siblings, that how they would move independently and also to as a unit, right? So they taught them practicality, right? So what to expect from the world around them. And so things were very much similar to a way that the Gen Xers were raised, but with a bit more hands-on, right? Teaching some of those core values while also to instilling independence and resilience. So it's no surprise that millennials actually adapted many of these values, that they actually are incredibly adaptable to most environments. In many ways, they serve just like the Zennials, which we've not really spoken a lot about. They actually serve as the bridge. They serve as the connectors. They serve as the glue within the workplace, right? They tend to be very entrepreneurial in spirit because they've experienced an awful lot in their growing up in their childhood, as well as when they started to enter the workforce, which we'll cover here in just a few moments. They actually they are the most educated. They carry the most degrees of any of the generations, and there's good reason for that. So just as a sidebar, so we know that boomers have taken a pathway or boomer women entering into the workforce, right? How they moved into that space, taking on positions that we're talking about post-World War II, right? Where they're moving into the space of actually starting to take on the positions that were not filled by the men who went off to war when they came back. They were now moving into other positions. We were starting to evolve into this dual income household in the Gen X period. And so these are the steps that were taken. Now for millennials are moving into the workplace with a different lens, right? So now it's expected that women be in the workforce, that women can actually pursue careers. Now, and in doing this, you had boomers who were fighting for their position into executive positions, And then Gen X, who were now bumping up against that to try to take over for the boomers, many boomers not choosing to retire and to stay into many of those leadership and executive positions. Millennials now coming at the heels of Gen X trying to get into the workforce, they started to feel the strains of how do I develop a career kind of in this space. And so there's kind of this hand at the door that says, well, you're not yet qualified, right? Because although while boomers and Gen X may not have the degrees to support what are now considered requirements for some positions, in many ways the Gen Xers actually told the millennials, you have to go back and get an advanced degree, right? So it's great to have your bachelor's, but you also need to pursue these masters and advanced degrees in order to qualify for many of these positions, right? Where the Gen X and boomers have spent decades building their career, and the experience was the heavy weight that actually qualified them into those positions. Millennials are now having to pay their dues, if you will, via going through the education system. So that's a sidebar to say, this is why they also to have why they hold the most degrees of any generation, and actually disproportionately amongst women within this group. Now, they also to have the highest amount of debt that is due to student loans, and there's some animosity associated with that, right? Because at college, university in the US has grown to be incredibly expensive. And so you're talking about millennials graduating with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And that's not typically because of their bachelor's, it's typically because of these advanced degrees, their masters, their PhDs. I have known millennials who I have worked with who have carried 150,000 plus in student loan debt simply because of their masters and their PhDs. Now they are highly intellectual, highly educated, highly qualified to do many things, and they're barely qualifying for entry-level positions. So, all right, that is the rabbit hole number one that I have started for today. We could go on forever about this topic, but so let's get us back on track. So they hold the highest amount of debt due to student loans. This is also impacting how it is that they're entering into the workforce. They've also started the gig economy, right? So the side hustles, they embrace this greatly. Where we started to see a lot of this freelancing work with Gen Xers. They really started to embrace this with the millennials, with actually actively having these side gigs. And part of it is due to the exorbitant amount of cost of living expenses, as well as the amount of debt that they have incurred. So think of side hustles like driving for Uber, maybe taking on Airbnb position or properties, things of that nature, in response to this kind of economic instability, right? Not being able to survive just on one income. They've also too been delaying the development of their families, right? Getting married. Many of these things are as a result of the amount of debt that they are, the burden of the debt that they've been carrying. So they believe in having what's important to them is having purpose-driven work, having career opportunities, having compensation to support not only their experience, but the path that they've chosen to be able to start a career, as well as attractive benefits, right? So give them a reason to want to be associated with your company and your organization. So while those may see this through the lens that they are job hopping about every 2 to 3 years, this is their way of trying to catch up, right? So, and also to recognizing that the concept or the idea behind loyalty is in fact entirely misunderstood, right? Loyalty with any company is that it doesn't work both ways, because companies are not necessarily loyal to them. So they are willing to leverage their expertise, their experience, their specialty, and also to make sure that aligns with the organizations that they are lending their experiences to. Oh, okay. Shannon, thank you very much for 6 figures of student loan debt. Oh my goodness. After grad school see, 36,000 to impact a 6-figure loan debt, that is absurd. And that is a topic for, we can dive into that another day, as to what are some of the reasons behind those six-figure loan debts that we've had. And you have to choose, your own peace. And I'll tell you, this is one of the reasons why millennials, especially millennial women, are really reclaiming their peace, to say, listen, my job is not my source of peace. It's not my source of happiness. It is a means to an end. So, okay. And Shannon, thank you very much for sharing that. Okay, so let's keep going. Let me tell you a little bit more about why I care so much about intergenerational communication. Right. So after 2 decades in healthcare, I got burnt out on corporate parenting. You've heard me say this before. Corporate parenting is paying your dues, right? Serving your time. It's toughen up, right? This is how we do things around here. This is how we've always done it. So just deal with it, right? Not being open to change. Or you have to put in your time in order to climb the ladder. All of these things just perpetuates the noise that we are not, in fact, conclusive and accepting of a new way of doing things, a new way of approaching things. And if you've been on my talks before, you've heard me talk about how boomers really had to break open the door, boomer women, in order to get us at the table. Well, we're now starting to have a larger voice at that table. And so now we're continuing to carry the torch. Now, what this looks like is that we have to bring the experiences from the past together, right? We have to understand the foundation that boomer women and Gen X women have laid for us in the workforce so far. And how do we continue to carry the torch? Well, millennial women have picked up that torch, right? So I had to work for years to get there. I mean, so as a Gen X leader, I have seen, I've heard, and perhaps maybe I've even perpetuated some of this noise throughout my career. Things that sound like, oh my goodness, they're so entitled, right? I had to work years to get here, and they think they can just get there overnight, right? Or I'm tired of fighting to be heard. So I just stay quiet. I just remove my voice from sharing in those spaces, right? Or my age has nothing to do with my value, right? I'm hearing this on both sides, between boomers and Gen X, as well as from millennials and from Gen Z. They're feeling silent, right? Like they've been silenced during these times because either they feel that boomers and Gen X, that their experience is irrelevant to the future, or millennials and Gen Z are too new in their career to have truly understood what that experience looks like. And so there's an awful lot of shaming, an awful lot of silencing that is happening in these discussions. So most people, they found a way to kind of navigate their conscious bias, right, around gender, race, and even around ageism, but rarely identify their unconscious bias related to generational. Right. So this is like an affinity bias because they favor others who are similar to themselves. Right. So you're identifying on a group around your generation. And so some of that noise I was talking about, right, as far as with, being entitled, or they're all just so lazy, or you can't dance on TikTok to make money. There's a foundation. There's some rooted causes there that we need to start to unearth. And what my intention is to really start to bring some of these conversations up, to get people talking, right? So people simply just don't hear the words that they're saying, or they don't address the root of those decisions or those actions, right? So what's actually leading them to believe the things that they are and to actually act the way that they are? I have conversations often with my friends and my family and with clients that say, I didn't realize that by saying that's actually how it's being interpreted. Or I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. Part of it, and I'm not here to shame you. This is something that we all do in some way or another, right? And I'm not shaming or calling out any generation. We all have a baseline that we have to meet, and that starts with awareness, right? Most people, they adopt this corporate parenting mentality and they raise their teams rather than lead them. So I do this work to raise awareness around the generations, to help teams identify what their biases feel like, what they sound like, how they're creating this experience within their workforce, whether they are a leader or whether they are an individual contributor. We are all contributing to the flavor of the soup. Okay. And to help people to build the bridge to the future of the work that is going to benefit all of us. And yes, there is an ROI to doing this, because when you do the right thing, also known as taking care of your people, they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel valued, and that then leads to them being more apt to stay. Right? Think about the retention, or the cost it takes to actually rehire or replace a talent. They are more engaged. Think of all the missed opportunities, because if you're silencing your team, either knowingly or unknowingly, they're not being creative and innovative in those spaces. They're not bringing their full selves to be able to help you and to help your team to advance, to continue to innovate. And also, too, this helps you to attract great talent, because bad news spreads very fast, like a wildfire, right? But when you build a great reputation, that is actually the foundation for doing so, is when you pour into your teams. Okay. All right. So now let's work on our awareness about the millennials. Let's dive into this one. So millennials were born some very tumultuous times in the US, right? And we're not comparing between the generations. This is just about understanding what was happening when they were being reared, right? When they were children, and then when they were entering into the workforce, right? So remember, they were born between 1981 and 1996, okay? So at the time that they were children, we had a very low unemployment rate. We had the AIDS epidemic. We had Reagan in office. We had the stock market was crashing. We had the Challenger rig exploded for millions to see, both online and many in person. We had the Gulf War, if you remember Desert Storm, right? So our country was going through an awful lot. We had the World Trade Center bombing. We had the Oklahoma City bombing. Domestic terrorism was on a rise, and people were feeling unsafe in this space, right? The LA riots, we had a lot of racial tension. We've talked about before the racial tension that existed when boomers and Gen Xers were growing up. This was continuing, right? So think about the war on drugs also too was happening at this time. So, and then into the time where they were starting to enter into the workforce as early as the 2000s. We also too saw 9/11, domestic terrorism, our country coming together around a tragic event that took thousands of people's lives, right? The dot-com era that was supporting our economy started to burst. Okay. In response to 9/11, we have this invasion into Iraq. We have Osama bin Laden being killed. We have the Great Recession, right? So as they are starting to earn money, starting to step in their career, we're having a recession in the country where people are struggling. So when I tell you that they invented the gig economy, right? The multiple revenue streams, it was out of necessity, as well as the feeling of economic instability. So they were responding to that. They were taking advantage and taking their future, taking control of their careers. So they've always been navigating this space of having multiple revenue streams. Now, while we think that all of this has actually started to evolve more recently, no, it's just that they're leveraging different tools to do so, right? Social media has actually created or carved out a path for people to be able to have access to greater revenue streams at this time. Now, I'll talk about that more next week when we start to dive into Gen Z. There's also to think about the Sandy Hook school shooting. Now, while school shootings have always been a challenge and always been a problem within our country for many reasons that I will not get into politically, that this was also too televised. People started to see that we thought that these school shootings were, if you will, limited to the high school realm. Well, this started to touch us down to impacting the smallest, most defenseless people in our society, these children. And so all of this was happening at the same time that they were entering the workforce, right? The 45th president was elected and started to implement a series of orders that were destabilizing or dividing our country in many different ways. And then, as they were already done entering, this is new into their career, then we went on to complete lockdown, COVID-19, right? COVID-19, I say that there were an awful lot that we lost, not only American lives, but also to the things that we were able to gain through this time. The silver lining was greater access to this hybrid and remote opportunities for us. How it is that we were to actually move into doing work, right? Okay, all right, now that I've hit you with the sledgehammer, now let's start talking about some of the things that we gained, right? What are the things that we gained collectively, even as women in the workforce? Now, you've heard me talk about before what was happening in the 70s and the 80s. So women were starting to get greater access to controlling of their finances, right? With the equal credit opportunity, we're able to open their own accounts, hold credit, even take out loans that were just in their name. Before 1974, women could not do this without a male signer, without a male co-signer. Okay. Roe v. Wade. So in the 70s, we started to get more independence as women, right? So with the introduction and the approvals of contraceptions, of Roe v. Wade, sexual harassment was starting to be viewed in the workplace as discriminatory behavior. So these were gains that were coming through the Boomer and the Gen X era, right? As they were moving. So really, the Boomers were leading an awful lot of that. And then we started to see violence against women, domestic violence was starting to. We were starting to get some gains there, to some ground on how we could actually defend ourselves, and the law would stand behind us in this space. Why does this matter for the workforce? Is because the perception of women in our communities is reflected and personified within the workplace. How it is that we went from being secretaries, and I'm not saying anything about those positions. We went from only having these pink positions, right, to only being at the service of others within the company, only taking care of others, stepping into a motherly role within the corporate environment. And we started moving into greater responsibility. We started to, if you saw my chart before, around this time, we started to gain greater visibility into these executive and leadership positions. So no longer only doing one thing and at service, we actually started to be seen as strategic thinkers, strategic thought partners in these spaces. There was also to the introduction of Family and Medical Leave Act, giving us access to being able to support us when women were taking time off to have children and having a job to be able to come back to. This was huge because women they were automatically assumed that when you have a child, you just move into motherhood. You do not pursue your career. The FEMLA actually gave us greater access and greater rights around this. Continuing, you already mentioned the internet and the dot-com boom gave women greater access to the startup space, right? Where you could start to be innovative in this. And many founders, actually 50% of the founders were actually Gen X. And of those, you had a significant number of women who were stepping into executive and leadership positions within that space as well. All right, so moving into 2000s, when they were entering into the workforce, we had the 44th president, Barack Obama, was elected president and served 2 terms, and we're passing a series of legislation that were both in support of not just of women, but also of equity and equality within our country. So creating a sense of stability while we were also experiencing great turmoil due to the domestic terrorism and all the other things I was mentioning. We also had the Fair Pay Act was passed during his administration that made it illegal for women to be paid differently for doing the same job. We also to start to see women take on multiple roles within the military. This uh, in 2013, women were actually allowed to, or all positions within the military were now open to be held by women. This is huge. So we're talking just 12 years ago, right? We also too had same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015. We have the Black Lives Matter movement that were in response to a lot of the racial tensions we were seeing. This launched actually as in response to the Trayvon Martin case and those decisions. We later see how the country was responding due to George Floyd. The Me Too movement, greater women independence, right? So having a voice in this space around sexual harassment within the workplace. Now, all of this matters is because the perception and the acceptance and the tolerance, if you will, of women in the workplace, this was shifting. Not only were we moving into leadership positions, but we were also too starting to be more embraced in the workforce and not only seen as in our motherly or nurturing roles. Now, just as a sidebar, not every woman is going to have a child. Not every woman is going to be married or be in a heterosexual relationship. So we started to have this greater accepting and visibility of marginalized groups and the national embrace, if you will, of the differences that we hold. And so this I would call this a blossoming within our within my lifetime of how it is that women started to actually to step into their power both in the workforce and in society. So okay. All right. I think I've covered everything there. I also too want to make sure to call out there has still been a series of challenges, even though we've had all of these gains. The perception of women, right? Motherhood, that you when you step away from a role, FEMLA only protects you to have a job when you return after 12 weeks. It does not protect you from having the same job, the same level of responsibility, right? So, and because women are most impacted by stepping away to have a child, and that can be a series of months, right? If you have the time to be able to support yourself while you're off and the finances to do so, then there's this thought of when you return, right? There's still a rooted or foundation where people still think that your primary responsibility should be your children. So and you returning to the office, returning to your career, there's still a stigma that is attached to that we're still fighting and battling today, right? Our reproductive rights have been under attack in this time, in the time that women were entering the workforce, that millennial women were entering the workforce, and we see that as still a conversation today. We've had continued unrepresentation in leadership position, now specifically in Fortune 500 companies, as to whether or not we are being represented in the C-suite, in the executive positions. This is not just about the creation of middle management that happened during the Gen X period in response to being able to support many of these roles and to support women stepping into some of these roles. We're talking about the decision makers, right? We're talking about those who are leading, who are engaging with at the board level, who are making decisions and driving decisions for these Fortune 500 companies who are still heavily underrepresented in that space. That right now, you heard me say earlier that that the millennials actually hold the greatest number of high advanced degrees of any generation. They also own 2/3 of the debt that is associated with that, with those advanced degrees. So this is also to allow or delayed their financial independence. Many millennials have delayed their families. They have delayed getting married. They have delayed a series of what we would call traditional life milestones simply because it is too expensive to do so. So even with all of these gains, women have continued to be challenged in these areas and many more than what we can go into today. Okay, Now, if you know me to listen, that there's always two sides of every coin, and we take the good with the bad, but we have had so many gains throughout these decades of generations entering into the workforce. So women have been carrying this torch. Now, one thing I always love to do when I talk about the generations is to give you some type of pop culture reference, right? What was happening? What's kind of, and these are not necessarily pop culture references that tell you how we were shaping the generation, but more so to speak to why do these matter in reference to the and understanding kind of the generations. Now, while I go through some of these, I would love to hear some of your favorite maybe movies, television, TV series, documentaries, because I can't include all of them here. I'm giving you a couple of them that were notable for me. So, The Matrix, right? Yes, although we call this like a sci-fi paranoia, a computer paranoia film, it also too allowed us to question reality, right? To question what it is that we exist in on a daily basis. Now, this is important because the millennials started to really question this idea of corporate culture, right? The idea of this. If anybody ever saw the Joe versus the volcano, which is more of a Gen Xer film, but breaking the monotony of doing the day to day, right? And so they started to redefine what the work culture could look like from day one. And the Matrix, to me, speaks to this generation because this they started to question this idea of corporate loyalty, right? What does this actually look like? And so I think most people have seen the Matrix series or trilogy, so I definitely support it. Slumdog Millionaire. What I love about the presence of these films is that it started to bring other ethnicities into the conversation, right? Because often in the US, this is just a conversation when we talk about race, is just about black and white, and it is so much more than that. And so Slumdog Millionaire also too was giving us a view into like this rags to riches story, kind of Bollywood styles, introducing addition culture that might have been new to some of us, right, and giving us a lens into that experience. All right, The Dark Knight, which arguably to me is the greatest Batman ever made, and you can fight me on that one. But it's a psychological, view about what heroism looks like, right? And so one of my favorite, and if also too, if you're interested in music, as one of the greatest soundtracks to ever accompany any film, next to Inception. So all right, The Social Network examined the rise of Facebook and digital power. This is where we started to give rise to the power of social media and connecting online. Some would say this is the beginning of the dark ages of communication and connection for the human experience. Well, it opened up the world, right? It started to allow you to reconnect with, past connections and also to with present to build towards a future. So the social network gives you a really good understanding as to kind of how that started to shape. Facebook was, integral in really forming that. And the Black Panther, one of my favorite films, greatest Marvel movie in my opinion ever made, and it's really celebrating Black excellence through the lens of Hollywood, right? So what could this look like, and really giving us a lens into a sliver of African culture. And so I personally saw this movie, I think at least a dozen times in the theater when it came out because I just loved how it embraced the Black community, certainly in the U.S. And so, all right, and then next, I feel similarly about Get Out. Right, it's just the social psychological horror film that is so amazing. If you haven't seen it, you have to. And so, why do all of these movies matter? Is because to me, they're starting to speak to the evolution of how it is that we were starting to appear, not only in the workforce, but within our community. And you heard me say earlier that what we are experiencing in our communities is personified in our workforce. Now, movies start to take that shape and tell the story of the things that are culturally relevant at that time. And so many of these films are starting to speak to some of the underlying issues that we're continuing to work through throughout this period. Additionally, television. So I won't go into great detail with these, but Friends, I think everybody knows that. Scandal, one of my favorite series, and then How to Get Away with Murder. But I also too want to call out that the work that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been doing for the rights, for women's rights, and actually for really for equity, right? For equality amongst the sexes. And her lifetime work is so beautifully captured in this documentary, really speaks to the plight of women and how it is it, even just down to the word choice that we're choosing. And so highly recommend for you to dive into that docuseries to learn a bit more about her contribution to our space. Okay, so let's continue. I'm going a little long today. So, millennial women, what are they feeling? What are they experiencing in the workforce today? Well, they're starting to, or have been, in this transition phase of moving into these management positions, leading teams. Now, they're not necessarily new to this, but they are finally being given some of the opportunities to do so. The mix right now around from boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z in the workforce right now is about boomers represent about 5% of the executives throughout the US, while Gen Xers have about 50% of those positions. Millennials are around 35%, and Gen Z are just under 5% or so. And now, what's important is over the next 10 years, this is actually going to shift where millennials and Gen Z are actually going to hold the majority of those leadership positions. And in particular, millennials are actually going to be the ones holding about 50% of those executive positions. So between Gen X and millennials, there's going to be that shift, right? So Gen X, where they are at 50%, will move to about 35%. And right now, what we're experiencing is a lot of Gen X are being pushed out of the workforce. Now, that is what the work I do is in response to that, is because you cannot push out an entire generation because there is still information that you need and experience we need to be able to learn from every generation. So please adopt a multi-generational strategy. This is how you actually start to pave the road toward a successful future. All right, I think that's rabbit hole number 5. But anyways, so what are they also experiencing? They are struggling with this burnout of work-life balance because we know that it doesn't exist. They are prioritizing their mental health because that is what is most important. They are no longer part of the thinking that, or the mindset that you can burn that candle at both ends and be successful. No, they have seen their parents do it. They have seen their older siblings do this, and they are not having it. They are done with it. They're reclaiming their peace and re-identifying what success looks like for them. They are demanding transparency and inclusion in the workforce. They are, regardless of what's happening at the federal and the state level, they are demanding DEI commitments and actions behind those commitments, right? What does that follow through look like? Because millennials, they also too understand, and every generation understands this. This is a division within our country, is that DEI is not just about pursuing a Black agenda. DEI is about giving access to disabilities, is about setting up ramps, if you will, right? Ramps at the federal and state level, and for federal and state buildings, for libraries. This is one example. It's about equity. It's about equality across all groups. And that's what I think most people miss about DEI, that it's not targeted or just benefiting the Black community. It is in fact benefiting all of us and greatly impacts and supports women and our rights and our ability to be able to have rights not only in the workforce, but in our communities. Okay, that was a worthwhile rabbit hole, but I will continue. They're also too feeling challenged by the hybrid work battles, because as they're moving into these leadership positions or management positions, they are also too having to support outdated policies that are misaligning with their values, because COVID gave us a a mirror, if you will, a looking glass into what is actually possible. And what that looks like is that people can be trusted. They can be productive. They can get the work done that is necessary. They can be innovative. They can be available. But the outdated policies where there's a misalignment there is that there is a sense of lack of control. And typically, the older generations are holding a lot of this thought where they think if I don't see you working, you're not working. If I cannot, you should be available 24, not 24/7, 40 hours a week, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, 8 to 6, or whatever that looks like. And what the millennials also too are in this bridging the gap between them and Gen Z, where they say, listen, I don't have to be constrained by these times. I am a professional and I can execute the role that you've asked me to do. Now, if you also do have a misalignment in how it is that you are managing your teams, you're not pulling in their best ideas because you're prioritizing the time or the time served, the time that they are available, putting them into meetings where they're not necessarily providing value. It's the outdated thinking that is actually driving your best talent away from you, especially millennials. And they are straddling this bridge because they recognize that we cannot pull forward everything from the past in order for us to leverage and get to a space strategically moving forward. And so they're struggling with balancing their values with the policies that they are being given to enforce. They are also too are feeling stuck in this economic uncertainty. There are a series of layoffs that are actively happening and have been over the last year or two that are fully reinforcing this gig economy that they created, right? That not only can I not afford to buy a house, can I not afford to have a family, to start a family, or even to be independent. Many are finding themselves living back at home with their parents for that very reason. And so they have multiple jobs, multiple revenue streams, and executing at them, but they're not feeling certain. They're not feeling that they are stable in how it is they can continue to move within this economy. And present day is providing an awful lot of instability as well. So, but what's next for millennial women, right? They are redefining this leadership style. They are reshaping what the modern workforce looks like by bringing empathy into these spaces, right? Bridging that gap between outdated policies and into the future, right? So providing purpose-driven leadership, helping their teams to understand that the work that they do and helping their leaders to align the right work that is both impactful and meaningful towards their teams. They are prioritizing their financial independence. They are no longer allowing their corporate jobs or any job to dictate to the levels of which they can experience their joy. Work is not their identity. So they are building multiple income streams and they are redefining what their career looks like. Next week, I'll be talking a bit more about how Gen Z is even taking this to the next level, right? So millennials are also too stepping into the executive roles. And when they do so, they are going to be bringing with them an agenda to reshape what this future looks like, what the balance looks like, what flexibility looks like. Now, this could be the introduction of new staffing models, right? You'll hear me talk often about how we need to be able to approach and be flexible on what it looks like when people are entering into their career, moving throughout their career, as well as to perhaps maybe sunsetting their career, right? In the last phase of their career. What does that look like for them? Now, this might mean introducing some greater understanding of how individual contributors can also promote within your company without taking on added responsibility of managing staff. You'll hear me say often, just because someone is good at doing a job does not mean that they're good at managing people, especially if you do not prepare them how to do so. All right. Additionally, does it look like, moving from a fully employed model to, to carving out some opportunities for contract work, right? So there's an opportunity there and even a cost savings for many organizations. So, all right, that is sidebar number or rabbit hole number infinity. Now, what millennial women comes to mind when you think about when you've heard me talk about some of these things, right? The empowerment, their influence, the glue that they are serving within your workforce. Somebody is popping into your mind, and I want you to just take a moment to just send them a note, an email, a text, a message, just a note of appreciation. Because while you might not have worked with them directly, they are moving and carving out a future, or impacting or influencing a corner within their sphere of influence in a way that sometimes we just need to be reminded or called out and appreciated. So, if you will, please take this moment to reach out to a millennial woman in your life who has impacted you in some way, or you've witnessed some of the greatness that they are starting to unveil. All right, now next, so retaining your multi-generational team requires an awareness of your generational biases that keep you stuck in the past and keep us from moving forward. So let's talk. If you want to turn your generational differences into strengths, you want to start to leverage your teams, the differences within your teams, to start to get them on the right path to communication. Because you'd be interested if you were to a simple implementation of just a communication guideline can do wonders for your team. Get everybody on the same page, because one of the biggest gripes I hear amongst the people I work with is, why do we always have to be in a meeting, right? Why does everything require a meeting? Or why do I always get a call instead of a text? Why can't you just send me a message, right, over Teams or over Slack? These are just our telltale signs that there are communication barriers within your team, and these can easily be solved by putting together implementing some guidelines around this. You want to be able to future-proof your workforce, set up some type of succession planning. You want to be able to forecast what your team, what your business is going to look like in the future. Part of that strategy has got to be you understanding the team that you're working with. If you want to be able to retain your best and to attract the top talent, this is how you do it, is by having a clear strategy and developing that leadership pipeline. All right. So there's a QR code on the screen if you want to set up some time with me, because these are the problems that I help organizations solve. I help leaders solve on a daily basis, because these are solvable problems. We're not talking about things that we cannot overcome. This all starts with having the right conversation and aligning on our values and where we are today and what the path is to get there. All right. Now, all month long, we're celebrating Women's History Month, and this is our third week into it. So, moments in history where women have contributed greatly to the workforce. And today we just covered millennials and how it is that they are reshaping the workforce. But if you want a masterclass on employee retention, engagement, and breaking through those barriers, you need to study the women of our past, our present, and our future who are challenging the status quo for the good of all. So join me next week. We're going to be talking about the the Gen Z women in leadership and what's next for them. So we'll be back here at the same time, Wednesday, March 26th. I think it's about 10 a.m. Pacific time, right here. So until then, if you don't have that link, go to my profile. You'll see it in events. Go ahead and register. And these replays are all available to you. All available to you even after I go live. But thank you very much for your time today. It has been an honor. I really appreciate your attention. Once again, I am Christina Green, and thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, take care. I'll see you soon.